Right, I have noon, so should we start? All right, greetings everyone. Assalamu alaikum. Good evening, maybe, good afternoon, or good morning. We are all here today as part of the series on human development topics and constructs that we here at the International Institute of Islamic Thought have been offering for almost 2 years now, even before the pandemic and before the Zoom land new lifestyle we all have. My name is Ilham Nasser. I'm the director of the Human Development Program. Empathy is one of our constructs that we took on and we research in our mapping the terrain study, empirical study that I see some people here in the audience were part of. So I want to thank you all for being here. This is going to be a webinar, so please make sure you put your questions or any notes you want us to convey to our lovely speaker here today. Put that in the chat or in the Q&A. We are very honored today to be hosting and listening to Professor Sarah Conrath. Professor Conrath is an associate professor of philanthropic studies at the Indiana University Lilly Family School of Philanthropy and an affiliate professor at the University of Michigan. Sarah is the director of the interdisciplinary program on empathy and altruism research, a research lab with a primary focus on motivations, traits, and behaviors relevant to giving, volunteering, and other pro-social behaviors. Today's talk will focus on the power of empathy in education, and we will let Sarah start sharing with you her thoughts with some questions in mind. For example, what is empathy? Why is it important for others and oneself? And then what can we do to increase it? So I want to give the stage and welcome you again, Sarah, for being here with us, and thank you for being here with us. Give you the stage and I will turn my video off, and please, again, if you have questions or if you have any notes you want to convey, just put them in the chat. I will monitor the chat during the talk, and if you want to use the Q&A, you're welcome to do that as well. Thank you again, and Sarah, please go ahead.
Thank you so much for the introduction, Dr. Nasser. And thank you for also reading a little bit about the questions that I'm going to be addressing today. And I just want to say thank you all for coming today as well. I know there are people from all over the world here, and I really appreciate you taking the time to have this conversation today. I'm a social scientist. I've spent over a decade studying the topics I'm going to present today. And even though this seems a bit boring, I just want to assure you that the statements I'm making are all going to be based on scientific research. You're not going to see citations. You're not going to see kind of like the sciencey, type of talk today, but you're going to hear the word research says. You're going to hear that a lot. And of course, if you would like to know anything about the specific studies I talk about today, you can contact me or you can read my recent chapter that I published on this topic. So we're going to start with just what is empathy. And obviously, there are many definitions. And if you stop for yourself and think, and you might even want it in the chat box, I can't monitor it easily, but you can talk amongst yourselves and share your own definitions of empathy. But what's funny about studying this topic is that even empathy scholars fight over the definition, which is really, we tend to be nice people, but we get very heated. And so, there are all these different definitions. But many of us, at least empathy scientists, agree that there's one more cognitive type of empathy that involves, reading other people and imagining their perspectives. So we're going to call this perspective taking. And there's also a more emotional type of empathy that involves feeling care and compassion for other people, which we'll call empathic concern. So the way I like to think about it is people can have empathy with their head, and they can also have empathy with their heart. Now, this is what I don't think empathy is, and this is my opinion, and there are some debates on this, but I think that empathy, obviously the word empathy is used in many different ways, and the most beneficial types of empathy, both for others and for the empathic person, are those that are actually focused on understanding and feeling compassion for other people. So in other words, other-oriented empathy. Some people use the word empathy to describe less mature forms of empathy. They are maybe forms, but they're more earlier in our development. And they involve more of the self. For example, it's not emotion contagion, not personal distress. It's not putting yourself in someone else's shoes, and it's not pity or sympathy. Having an unclear sense of boundaries between oneself and others, emotion contagion, or becoming overwhelmed when others are in need, which is called personal distress, are examples of less beneficial types of empathy. These generally don't feel good. And what happens in those situations is that people start to avoid the individual need or situation. Like they'll change the channel, or they'll just kind of, step away if they can, research finds, rather than just stepping forward and acting with care, such as giving or helping when someone is in need. So those first two, they tend to be more about the self, or about a sort of a fusion between the self and others. Empathy is also not about imagining how you yourself would act or feel in someone else's situation. And I understand that that's a common thing to do. You want to try to at least start with a basis of comparison. But maybe you could start there, but I wouldn't suggest ending there, because what if you were in a similar situation, but you ended up acting very differently? In that case, you might actually end up judging somebody for what they did, rather than actually trying to understand it or imagine it from their perspective. What does it mean to them? And that's what I think is a more other-oriented form of empathy. And finally, empathy isn't about feeling pity for others. Because when we pity others, we often see their experiences as separate from us. And we often have like condescending feelings, like we kind of feel sorry, we kind of look down, right? Rather than looking at our common humanity and these experiences of suffering that we all go through, and that we all need each other. So I think I'm not trying to just be like an academic about this. It actually has implications for the way we actually care for others, and also whether empathy even benefits ourselves. So I think going back to the first slide, that smart empathy is what I like to call it, is the kind that's focused on others, and it's about imagining their perspectives or feeling care and compassion for them. Whereas less mature or less developed empathy that kind of isn't good for oneself or others. There are different forms like you see here in this slide. Oh, why is empathy important? Well, I think the most obvious reason, the biggest reason, is that it benefits others in need. And of course, there's also positive empathy when you feel joy for others when they're feeling good. And that's not going to be the focus of this talk, but obviously I acknowledge that's important too. Decades of scientific research has confirmed that empathy inspires people to help others and also to avoid harming them. Empathic people are more likely to help, give, share, volunteer, and cooperate with others. In fact, my research finds that the number one reason that people say they donate money or volunteer for nonprofits is because they care about others. So I think that's good news. A lot of us are giving and caring because it's about others to begin with. Empathy helps people to see a common humanity in others who might at first seem different from us. Studies find that more empathic people are less prejudiced and also less likely to believe that some groups are superior to others. That kind of thinking, believing that your group is better than others, is called social dominance. And empathic people are less likely to agree with that. They see more equality. I think that a world where we couldn't feel compassion for others and imagine their perspectives would actually be a pretty scary place. So it's an important quality just for care. Another reason that empathy is important is because it helps us to get along with others. First, a little funny, but true, it's actually good for dates. In fact, the number one trait that both men and women are looking for in romantic partners is kindness. In other words, nice guys and girls actually do finish first. Empathy also helps to smooth over existing relationships. It's sometimes described as social glue. In fact, research finds that more empathic people are more popular, more well-liked, are better able to solve conflicts, including conflicts between groups, and they have happier and stronger social relationships. As an example, we sometimes think of the stereotype of the mean girls or boys being the most popular, but one interesting study actually asked preteens to either do three kind things per week or 3 new things per week. The kind kids actually ended up being rated as more popular with their peers after a month of doing the kind acts. And it just gives you a sense of the fact that this is actually a causal effect, that people doing kind things is leading to more popularity. But empathy actually has surprising psychological and physical health benefits as well. Empathic people have good quality of life. They're happier, they have more meaning in life, and they're less depressed. Other research has shown similar effects for people who spend their time and money on others, including those who regularly volunteer or make charitable donations. So the giving trait of empathy and the giving behaviors both make people feel happy and good. There's a myth that empathy could cause burnout, and I'd like to address that at this point. Actually, the research finds that empathy, other-oriented empathy, helps to protect people in high-stress occupations from burnout. But of course, I want to clarify that any benefits I'm describing are about perspective taking and empathic concern, those other-oriented forms of empathy. If someone tends to feel personal distress or emotion contagion, say like a doctor has a patient who's sick and then they get very distressed by that, this would actually put them at risk for burnout. So again, think about the smart empathy. The smart empathy is about others. My research also explores the health implications of empathy and giving behavior. One example is that we have found that people who score high in empathy actually have fewer stress hormones in their body during stressful events like giving a speech, which we actually do in our lab. We actually put people through like this a little bit and measure their hormones. And we do find that especially cognitive empathy, perspective taking, seems to be a buffer for stressful situations. I've also done research on narcissism, the other side. So extreme sense of self-focus, that's kind of like the opposite of empathy. And my research has found that narcissistic people basically walk around with these high stress hormones, especially narcissistic males. And having such high levels of stress hormones is bad for your health. It puts you at risk for later health problems such as heart disease. And what's interesting about this research is that in the self-reports, when you just ask them sort of how they're doing, they're not reporting high stress. They're saying they're fine, but their body is telling a different story, and it's a story that can predict later disease. Does this mean that caring people live longer? In fact, they do. In my recent research with LEQ, we found that older adults who said they were caring and friendly were actually 45% less likely to die 13 years later. So this is when they're in their late 70s. Our other research finds that volunteering is good for physical health. We see other effects also in whether they're living or dying, so just volunteering. And we also find that it depends on why they volunteer. So when people say they volunteer because they're going to receive some personal benefit, like maybe they want to get out of the house or learn something new, which are valid reasons to volunteer, those people actually don't experience the health benefit. It's only the people who say they volunteer because of some other reason. For example, because they want to help people or because it's important to people they love. Volunteering is also good for young people. And I've done some research and continue to do some research on volunteering in teens. The work is sponsored by AmeriCorps. And we think that the reason why volunteering is good for teens is because it helps them to regularly practice caring acts, often with trusted adult mentors and other peers who are also pro-social. As an example, one study found that compared to other extracurricular activities like sports or theater, volunteering was actually the best activity for kids in terms of promoting strong academic achievement and less risky behavior, like less alcohol drinking. So obviously there are many different extracurricular activities, but volunteering was associated with a number of positive outcomes in that study. Other studies have linked volunteering to higher self-esteem, lower teen pregnancy rates, higher grades, and less school dropout. And studies have found that volunteering is especially helpful for low-income youth. So another thing, although many people believe that selfish people get ahead, research actually finds that it's more empathic people who can enjoy more economic success. And I'm also working on this research question with that same grant with the AmeriCorps funding, in which we're following teenagers over time and examining how their volunteering and giving behaviors related to their later, financial indicators like attending college or like how much money they earn and other things like that. And we're finding some positives, some benefits. But I'll tell you about one example that I like. It's a study that followed kindergarten children over time and asked the kindergarten teachers to rate the children on things like, does this child cooperate with peers without prompting? Is the child helpful to others? Is the child good at understanding feelings? So you can see this is kind of an empathic type trait. And what they found was that the children who were showing more empathic traits were more likely to attend college later, and they were less likely to be in need of public assistance. So they were more likely to be employed when they were young adults. So they followed them for up to 19 years over the long term, and just found that this was seemed to be a benefit, even as you follow kindergarten children over time. Okay, so we'll now move into empathy in educational contexts. The nationally representative survey of 500 pre-K to 6th grade teachers in the US found that 86% of them often worry that the world is an unkind place for children. And when asked which was most important for their students' future success, I'm happy to report that 78% of teachers said kindness, and only 22% said good grades. They had to choose one or the other, and they chose kindness as the most important. We'll see in this section that actually the two are related. So they're not necessarily mutually exclusive. So I'm going to start with you can look at the pictures and guess what I'm going to talk about. I'm going to start with teachers, empathy in teachers. And bear with me because there's a lot of research on how empathy in teachers is related to student outcomes. So for example, the research finds that children learn better when they think their teachers care. And this translates to better academic outcomes. So this is just a big picture. Students rate caring teachers as more competent and more trustworthy. And students feel more attached to the school if they believe their teachers care about them. Students with more empathic teachers are also better able to focus and have more regulated behaviors in the classroom. For example, when researchers examined over 100 different studies, they found that there were 31% less behavioral problems in classes that had more relationship-oriented teachers. So more relationship-oriented teaching was associated with 31% less behavioral problems. Another remarkable study that I love trained teachers on an online empathy training program. It was I think it was 45 minutes. And there was a control group that got training. I think it was in using technology in the classroom. So they compared the results, these two groups of teachers, either online empathy training or online technology use. And what they found is that the teachers who received the empathy training were 50% less likely to suspend their students that year. Even difficult students deserve to be treated with understanding, and even these students deserve to reach their full potential. And empathy can help with this, and we can change our mindset and think about students in that way. Finally, research finds that more empathic teachers also have students with better academic outcomes. Now, this has been found in students ranging from elementary school to middle school to high school and also to university settings. And I think you can understand why. Many of us have had the experience of becoming pretty excited about a subject because we had a caring teacher. And it was based on the relationship with our teacher. We wanted to please them. We wanted to learn from them. They were legitimate to us. We trusted them. And this is what's happening in the classroom when a teacher tries to be empathic. And can you imagine how important that is right now and during a pandemic? So what this suggests overall, all this research, is that the way people learn is actually very social. We are more likely to learn and in a deeper way when we're in the context of having safe and trusting relationships. In addition to potential benefits of teacher empathy for student outcomes, research also finds that it's associated with less burnout in teachers. And I wanted to give you an example of a teacher who doesn't look burned out because, right now is a really hard time and it's very easy to find images of teachers who look and feel very burned out. And it is hard for teachers right now. They've had to adapt quite a bit during the pandemic. Learning empathy skills can hopefully help with that. I'm next going to review research on empathy within students. Children with higher social and emotional skills, like empathy, have better academic outcomes, such as higher grades, even when you control for various demographic variables and even when you control for IQ scores. When researchers compiled the results of over 200 school-based social and emotional learning programs with over 270,000 K-12 students, they found that these programs led to an 11% increase in academic competence compared to control groups. So these programs teaching us what we call sometimes the soft skills, they're actually having effects in ways that are measurable and benefiting students academically. Other studies that have specifically focused on teaching empathy and kind behaviors, not just broader social and emotional skills, those studies also find academic benefits. Beyond direct academic outcomes, research has found that those who have higher empathy are also less likely to cheat or plagiarize, and they're more likely to make ethical decisions. I think that's an interesting area of research because obviously as a teacher, you do have to think about not just how people are treating one another, but how they're making decisions about the learning. And now moving to the playground, bullying is a serious problem among middle school kids and adolescents. And research finds that children who are victims of bullying are more likely to experience mental and physical health problems if you follow them later in their lives. And even just seeing bullying makes bystanders anxious and uncomfortable at school. Many studies have found that more empathic children are less likely to bully, and they're more likely to intervene when they see bullying. Other research shows that programs that teach empathy can actually help to reduce bullying behaviors in the school. So taken together, all of this research suggests that empathy could help to improve schools, both in the classrooms and outside of them. Okay, that was a lot, so I'm going to do a quick review. So basically, we defined empathy as an other-oriented focus on imagining others' perspectives and feeling care and compassion for them. We provide some evidence that it's beneficial for others because of helping and giving, and it can be beneficial for the self in terms of mental and physical health. And I reviewed some ideas about how empathy works within educational contexts, and that it could be an important foundation for healthy educational environments. So given this, in this last part of my presentation, I'm going to review some key scientifically based strategies for increasing empathy. And after that, I'm going to share some programs that you can access if you're interested. So first, the obvious, I think it's implied in what I just talked about, that empathy is actually changeable. And if it goes down, it can go up. We can each fluctuate in our empathy and continue to grow in it. And it is true that some people are actually born with a little more empathy than others. There is a genetic component to it. So I think that makes it maybe easier for certain people. But all of us are born with the capacity for empathy. It's like a muscle. Some of us have more natural empathic capacity than others, but all of us have muscles that get stronger with exercise and practice. Empathy can be taught and learned, even for those of us who didn't win that genetic lottery of being naturally more empathic. Research finds that empathic growth is more likely if we're willing to grow and we believe it's possible. In other words, we have to have a growth mindset. And when we have that growth mindset, research finds that people are more motivated and will try harder to change and become more empathic. Okay, I'm going to discuss 10 effective empathy building strategies. And guess what? There's more than this, of course. Even 10's a lot, but I'll just share a few that I like and then some programs that I like as well. And we will have some time for conversation. Okay, so I think the first thing to consider is to put on your own air mask. Both teachers and students need to be in the right mindset to empathize with others. Those of us who are more aware of our own current states and our triggers will be better at empathizing with others because we'll be able to stop for a second, understand what we're feeling and what's happening with ourselves and how that might be affecting how we interact with people. Now, obviously, this research is very obvious, which is that it's difficult for us to empathize if we haven't got enough sleep and we're tired, or if we're hungry, or if we're angry, or we're stressed, or if we ourselves are in need of empathy right now. These temporary states are overpowering personal needs, right? We're focused on ourselves in those situations, and they get in the way of focusing on others' needs. So my first advice is to make sure these basic needs are taken care of in yourself before trying to be empathic or teaching students. In other words, put on your own air mask first so that you can help others. And I think this is not usually what you would expect in a talk on how to increase empathy, but this is really real. This is a hard time right now. A lot of us are feeling pretty exhausted and in need of care as well. And that's okay. If you're in need of care, reach out and get care, because that's okay. We're all in positions where we have harder times than others, and we can all be recipients of empathy as well as givers of it. So please take care of yourself and realize that it's okay to not be okay. Next, this is the most widely used method of increasing empathic concern, is just imagine others' feelings. So these studies for 30 years have shown that if you just ask people to imagine what a situation is like from another person's perspective, what they might be feeling and thinking, and how their life might, their life circumstances might affect what's going on. This can take like seconds. It's really quick. Research finds it's very effective, probably the most effective route to empathy that I know of. And it's really easy for anyone to try anywhere. You can literally do this. You can do this for animals. You can do this for people who are characters in novels. You can do this with a person you know well. You can do this with a person you don't know. I mean, it's a really powerful strategy. Of course, there are limitations to perspective taking, to strategy number 2. Namely, if we're honest, we often have no real clue about what other people might be thinking or feeling, even if we try our very best and have a good imagination. But at its best, perspective taking relies on educated guesses. Unfortunately, this can lead to perspective mistaking. Research finds that asking questions, active listening, and deep observation are better than perspective taking at times, because they allow people to become empathy detectives who look for clues and evidence rather than just guessing. Now, I think ideally the two work well together. You can ask and listen and observe, and you can also use your imagination to try to fill in any gaps. And so I recommend both of them together. So next, number 4, reflect on important values. Self-affirmation involves thinking about values that are important to the self. And I asked my son when I was making this talk, he's 9, and I said, for this value, what kind of picture should I choose? And he said, I think you should show a child with a mirror. So that's why we have this picture here. I thought that was very cute. Anyway, self-affirmation is what we call it in psychology. And these values can include things like being caring, being good at art, being creative, being independent, belonging to a social group, relationships with friends or family, or religious values. Research finds that when people are asked to focus on their most important value, it makes them feel calm. It lowers their anxiety. And as a result, they're able to be more compassionate and they're more willing to help. In my recent research, I find that when you give people a choice from a list of different values, the number 1 value, the most common value people choose, is compassion. Okay, the next one, number 5, is increased familiarity. Research finds that having previous experience with the recipient of empathy can make people more likely to empathize. It's easy to have empathy for similar others, but we can also have empathy for others who are different. Dozens of studies have found that intergroup contact, spending time interacting with people who are different than us, leads to lower prejudice and higher empathy for them. The researchers find that this is because the more familiar we get, the more knowledge we have about others. And again, we have less anxiety. Notice the word anxiety coming up, personal distress. That gets in the way of caring for others. But when we can reduce our own anxiety, then we can actually feel more comfortable and our compassion can be released. So again, let's get back to that number 1. Put on your own air mask. If you find yourself being distressed or anxious, there are things you can do to help with that. Many of us do want to be compassionate people. So we can work on our own anxiety and distress to get there. Okay, number 6. Research finds that people are more likely to empathize with others who they see as similar to themselves or those who they see as included in their in-group. Luckily, the boundaries of who is similar or included are very easy to change. For example, when trying to increase empathy, it's important to focus on different similarities, and those are easy to come up with. Like, you can think about similar experiences or the fact that we all have the same physical needs for food and water and shelter, or psychological needs like the need for love and safety. We all have emotions like we feel fear, feel comforted and need comfort, and so on. So just getting back to basic sort of what's common between you and anyone, like we all have commonalities, even when we're different. And then I love this here. There's a campaign that I really enjoy, the Coke campaign. And I picked this one. There's many good posters that I could choose from. Sometimes we are ruled by cats. Look for similarities, not differences. I picked this one because I have 2 cats, and I expect at some point someone's going to come and like make an appearance in this talk, and it's because I'm ruled by cats. So if you have a cat, if you own a cat out there, I hear you. I see a similarity between you and me. So that was easy. Okay, number 7, babies and animals. So even though similarity can help to increase empathy, research finds, literally comparing similarity to nurturing feelings, finds that nurturing feelings is a more powerful empathy builder. So yes, science does suggest that you can play with babies and puppies if you want to build your empathy. And it makes sense because babies and animals are vulnerable and they need our help. They also can't communicate verbally. So we need to use our empathy detective skills to try to understand them. So all that to say, translation, I think it means that you're not wasting your time when you watch cute puppy and cat videos online. Hopefully you're not doing that right now. Come back to me, let's keep talking. But you know, it makes me feel better about the times when I've enjoyed some, and I always want to see them in case anyone wants to send me them. Send me them on Twitter, I'd love to see them. Okay, number 8, literature and the arts. There's a large body of research, and I've been working on this topic myself, that finds that engaging with different types of arts can help to build empathy. Reading literature is one of the major ways that we can increase. We can read fiction, we can basically live, and what one of my students in class today said, we can live 15 different lives, you know, by reading books. But really, you can live 1,000 lives if you read books. You can read as many lives as books. So it really helps you to understand different perspectives than your own. And it's a good way to travel to different cultures and to just experience the world through the lens of other people's experiences. Taking acting lessons, theater and acting lessons also seem to be very effective. And that again has to do with trying to imagine a life from a different perspective than our own. There's also research showing that music helps to encourage empathy, likely because many forms of music are social and dependent on reading each other's social cues. So interestingly, actually visual arts are the type of art form that is not as, it's more inconsistent. Some studies find there's a positive effect on empathy and some studies find there's not. So there's just a question, but I think that I'm very interested in visual arts, and I think that if we teach visual arts in such a way as focusing in on, you know, noticing, using your empathy detective skills, like deep observation and focusing. For example, in this image here, you can try to look at what's happening between those 2 people. Who are they? What's their relationship? Why is it painted in that way? What does that say about the painter? What Picasso was thinking when he was painting that? And you can spend a lot of time in a more social and relational way looking at visual art and producing visual art. But oftentimes the way it's taught is focused on much more technical skills because it is so technical. But I'm really interested in just how to think about teaching that and exploring that in a more empathic way. I've been working with the Minneapolis Institute of Art. They have a Center for Empathy and Visual Arts, and they're very interested in that as well. Okay, number 9, role models. Research finds that people are more likely to behave prosocially in the presence of prosocial role models. This monkey see, monkey do effect has a scientific basis in social learning theory. And so to me, one take-home point here is that we should really think about who we're surrounding ourselves with, because if we're around pro-social people, it's going to make us, it's going to make it easier for us to want to care too. Another thought here is that educators should be aware of their important role as secure attachment figures. The attachment system is rooted in our earliest interactions with our primary caregivers, and it functions to help us feel safe and calm and loved and able to handle life's difficulties. Some research suggests that attachment security, when we remind people of somebody who unconditionally loves them, that this makes them feel less anxiety, less personal distress, and this opens up their heart for compassion and for care and help. And number 10, pro-social media. We often think of the negative effects of media, such as television, video games, and song lyrics. But research actually finds it really depends upon the content. So what you put in matters. Overall, the research finds that more violent media can encourage more aggressive behavior, but at the same time, more pro-social media can actually encourage more empathy and more positive behaviors. So really be careful about what you're putting in, and it's not like 100%. Obviously, we can watch something that's aggressive and not become aggressive, but it really does help to shape our behavior in certain ways and the thoughts that we're thinking. And then many of us assume that social media is associated with more narcissism, and research does support this, but here it's a bit complicated. Newer research finds that social media is also associated with more empathy. So they're like, it's attractive to two types of people, probably for different reasons. But there's one study I really love that followed teenagers over time, and it measured how much they use social media at one time point. And it found that the teenagers who used a lot of social media at the first time point were actually higher in empathy a year later. So social media was being used, I think, as an expression of their ways to care for their peers. I'm assuming that's what was going on in that study. And more research is needed. There's a lot more studies on studying the bad effects of social media. But in my new research on empathy and social media, we're actually finding that overall, there tends to be a positive relationship between empathy and social media. So I think this probably depends on why people use social media, how they use it. But I think that if I've been recently funded by the Mind and Life Institute to do research on what we're calling mindful digital engagement, mindful and pro-social, so a map to digital engagement. And we are specifically interested in working with teens to develop basically positive uses of technology, because it's here, it's not going anywhere. And we as adults even maybe struggle with how to use it in positive ways. But I think like anything, it would be helpful to have some training and guidance about the functions of media in our lives and how we can use it to support others. And when it comes to smartphones, which we often worry and fret about, my research has shown that it's actually possible to use them as teaching tools to build empathy in children and teens. So you can see on the bottom part of the screen, I've designed an app called the Random App of Kindness. I did that, had some teens help me with that, and I got their feedback as we went. And this is meant for, well, it's preteens and kids. It just has a number of different like small empathy practices that you can do in a few seconds at a time, and it's kind of gamified. And then there's also a program meant for teens and young adults called Text to Connect, in which they would get text messages just reminding them of things they probably already know, like in your next conversation, pay attention to the other person's body language and to try to understand what they're feeling. So that's a cognitive empathy message. So I've designed these two programs, and there's evidence that both of them are helping to increase empathy in young people. Okay, I'm now going to review a few programs that are available for educators if they want to integrate empathy in their curriculum. I'm going to start with some evidence-based programs that I've heard about through the research, and then I'm going to move on to just some available free stuff that you can download if you want to explore. So first, the Collaborative for Academic, Social, and Emotional Learning provides many free resources on social awareness and relationship skills, so empathy-related skills. It's a good place to find summaries of research on long-term outcomes associated with these programs. And CASEL also offers a free guide you can see here on how to find the best evidence-based programs for your school if you're looking for them. And I just gave you the middle and high school, but it's a really huge website. So if you're going to go to it, make sure you get a coffee and relax, enjoy it for a bit, because there's a lot of rich information there. But it is a highly reliable, scientifically, they translate research into practice. One example of a good program is called Second Step. And I just found out this was in my children's school when I was giving my practice talk to my cute little children. They were just like, oh, we know that. So this is it's actually an evidence-based program. It's got lots of evidence to show that it's actually does help to increase empathy and kind behaviors in schools, and it also helps to reduce bullying and aggressive behavior. Here are two other social emotional learning programs with some research evidence behind them. So Responsive Classroom is a student-centered SEL approach to teaching and discipline. It includes research and evidence-based practices that are designed to create a sense of joyful, engaging, and safe classrooms and school communities. And then Ruler is a systemic approach to SEL developed from the Yale Center for Emotional Intelligence. And Ruler stands for the 5 skills of emotional intelligence: recognizing emotion, understanding emotion, labeling emotion, expressing emotion, and regulating emotion. So hope you have a chance to look those up. And I hope this talk will be posted somewhere in case you need to look them up later. And Ruth of Empathy is kind of a different type of program, but it has some studies showing that it increases empathy and kind behaviors and reduces bullying in children. And the program involves having a baby come to the classroom for structured visits and letting that baby to teach children to pay attention to his or her emotions, needs, and desires. But personally, I think this is the cutest option available. So yay. Mary Gordon, the founder of the organization, is a wonderful person. And this is now a global program. So look it up and see if it's something that you would consider for your school. And empathy can be taught outside of the box too. I highly recommend strategically using field trips, even virtual ones, to integrate empathy lessons. For example, the Blanton Museum of Art in Austin has a program called Doing Social Justice with different virtual lessons and in-person lessons available for empathy or elementary, middle, and high school students. It uses art to teach students to explore cultural identities and to build caring communities. So I think this is an example where visual arts can actually be really helpful because it's a kind of a guided interaction. What students learn is that empathy is a skill that can be nurtured and should be nurtured in the context of injustices that they see around them. The program is also aligned with state education standards and includes several free lesson plans. Okay, now I'm going to move on. So the ones I just reviewed are ones that have been scientifically documented, have some effect. And then there are still some really strong, good resources that I highly recommend, even if right now we don't have, we still need to do more research on them. So one is through Ashoka, and they have this Start Empathy Toolkit, which is available for free. You can download it. It's beautiful and it's very helpful, easy to use, and it has many different exercises you can use in your classroom or for yourself. And like I said, I don't know of anyone who's yet scientifically studied how this toolkit works and how much it promotes empathy. But when I reviewed the exercises, they look like the types of exercises that would effectively increase empathy. It also has a number of other resources if you're interested to look at the website. And then there's the Random Acts of Kindness Foundation, and that provides free K-12 lesson plans on their websites. They have lessons that are aligned with national standards and have clear goals, use different learning modes, have very little prep time, and meet the needs of diverse sets of learners. There are 4 lessons per grade in English and Spanish. And they have actually run an evaluation study where they just found improvements in social and emotional learning from the beginning to the end of the unit. They didn't have a control group, at least to my knowledge. They haven't quite done that yet, but it still looks like a very strong program, and I recommend it. And we're near the end here. So now we're going to talk about teachers. Remember, number 1 was put on your own air mask, right? So teachers also need extra support to develop their empathy. And I wanted to share this wonderful organization, Fuel Ed. It's a Houston-based nonprofit that provides research-based training for teachers to develop empathy in themselves. And it goes far beyond what we can cover today. I personally got to attend one of their workshops actually before the pandemic. And it helped me as an educator, but more than that, it actually helped me as a person, because they really do go through, emotional awareness, trying to understand yourself and your own, the things that trigger you and the things that activate you. And it was really helpful for me. They now also offer virtual options, and I encourage you to check it out. There are some other teacher resources as well. And in my chapter, we talk about a few other ones. So that's what we have today with my content. But I wanted to summarize that empathy involves imagining others' experiences and feeling care and compassion for them. It can motivate us to help others in need, and it's the glue of healthy social relationships. And since it can help to buffer stress responses in our body, empathic individuals experience a number of mental and physical health benefits. Although some of us have more natural tendencies toward empathy, it is teachable and learnable using many different strategies and programs, including digital technology ones. So if we want to increase empathy in ourselves and in our students, this is possible, and it can help to promote more positive learning environments, even during a pandemic. And I just want to thank my funders, and to you, I'm excited to have a conversation with you.
Thank you so much, Sarah. This has been very, very informative, and there are lots of questions that I myself have. But I think what we will do now is, share with you some of the questions from our audience, and maybe I can squeeze in some of my questions as well. Okay. But let's start with the clarifying questions. I think you talked about the main differences, and that empathy can be close to compassion, kindness. One of the questions is, what are the main differences between those? And then another one around the same question, Paul Bloom shows between rational compassion and empathy. And he said we should be rationally compassionate. So the differences between compassion, kindness, and empathy, and then rational compassion and empathy. Could you please clarify?
I'll start with the
from
first.
Your research.
Okay, I'll start with the first. So difference between empathy, do you say empathy, compassion, and kindness?
Yes.
So I think of empathy as this umbrella term. We can have like empathy in the moment, or we can have empathy as kind of a personality trait. Those are the two distinctions we see in research. And when we're talking about this umbrella term, it includes compassion. Compassion is the other-oriented expression of care that a lot of times we will call, as researchers, we'll call it empathic concern, but like nobody in the real world uses that term. So to me, compassion is the same, right? It's like feeling empathic concern for others. You could feel it in the moment, or maybe you are just a more compassionate person. And kindness is kind of like, it's a term that could be a trait, a person is kind, or maybe they've done a kind behavior. So it's like ProSocial. I think a psychologist would use the word ProSocial, just to describe like a behavior that is intended to benefit others in some way. And I think kindness is a term that would be used more often just in our everyday language. I'm not sure if I quite answered that, but yeah, I agree. There's like a whole word salad of empathy words. And I have to say, I'm working on a project right now with Mark Davis, who helped design a very common empathy measure. And we are working with other people too, who are top empathy scientists. And we've asked them like to list all the terms they can come up with that mean empathy to them. And we came up with 233 unique terms.
Oh.
So we're in the middle of like trying to decide what to do with this information. But just to say that it can be very confusing, especially if you haven't spent a decade like studying it. But I think kindness is a useful term to describe pro-social behaviors, and compassion is one type of empathy. And as for rational compassion versus empathy,
right.
I actually wrote about this in response to Paul Bloom's book. You can look it up on Greater Good website. It's called, my essay is called, What's the Matter with Empathy? And I was arguing that the matter with the word empathy is that it means so many things to so many people. That's why I started with a definition right away when I talked about what I mean by empathy. So I guess the short answer is that when Paul Bloom talks about empathy, he's talking about what I would call either emotion contagion or personal distress. So he and I agree, I think, ultimately, that those are not very beneficial forms of empathy. But I don't call that like empathy, if that makes sense.
Right.
And the rational compassion part, I mean, It could mean, I mean, I'm for compassion. And I think it could also, his view of it, it could be more like a cognitive type of empathy. So it's like, I'm not sure. When I think about that, that work, I'm just like, I actually realize it just has a lot to do with definitions, but ultimately we're probably saying the same thing.
I'm actually can relate to the compassion versus empathy that you talked in our own study. We actually discovered in one of the publications that I wrote that really people don't have to be religious to be compassionate, or, and when I say religious, meaning practicing the religion, to be empathetic or compassionate. And one of the questions here relates to that a little bit. Someone is asking, are there studies comparing humanist empathy and religious-oriented empathy? And I think humanist in many contexts is used as the non-religious education or the, you know, like worldview like, type of education. Right. I think that's what the
like a secular type of compassion or humanity. Correct. Not based on religion. Well, what we do know about empathy and this topic, this broad topic of empathy and religion, is we are very aware, and this is a chapter I just wrote, that compassion, some form of empathy, is important in pretty much every single major religion. It's not just important, it's usually the central point of all the religions. So I think based on that, you would expect that religious people would be more compassionate, more empathetic than people who are not religious, but that's not what the research finds, which is like, you know, surprising, because you think about really, you would expect that. But you do find that it really depends on why people are religious and how they practice their religion. So it actually can help to inspire compassion in people. For example, if they're religious for more intrinsic reasons, like not because of what they're going to get, but because it's truly a belief that they really want to follow and it's very sincere, those people are more compassionate. And then in terms of, is there a difference between the way compassion is expressed in a secular way versus a religious way? That's a really good question, and it hasn't really been studied to my knowledge, because usually what we're doing is we're looking at the outcomes of compassion. So we want to see, for example, will somebody help? Will they share? Will they give? And what we find is compassion itself activates those behaviors. It doesn't matter whether your compassion is coming from your beliefs, your religious beliefs, or whether your compassion is coming from some sort of moral or philosophical belief.
Yeah, and of course that by itself brings a lot more questions that I have in mind. But...
Oh, I'm sure. I'm also sure that seems controversial, but I think that the question was really good because it shows us that maybe we need to study these things a little more carefully, because there might be something very subtly different about the way a more secular approach to compassion versus a more religious approach to it.
And in our study, and the mapping the terrain study that you're familiar with, we actually found that empathy predicts a lot of other pro-social values, skills, competencies, whatever you want to call them, soft skills, including forgiveness.
Yep.
Like if you're more empathetic, you're able to forgive, or at least in attitudes so far, that's what we know.
And that's something that replicates what we know about how empathy works. It's as I say, it's a good relational glue. Like obviously the reason why empathy can help us with resolving our conflicts, well, one step is just, you know, understanding that person's intentions, being willing to just basically err on the side of a positive belief about that person, trusting that person, and then moving on too, right?
Right, letting go. So another question was about something you shared regarding empathy reducing stress, and that's empirically proven. If yes, what were the variables used for the study? And I don't know if you want to address that here or just...
Is that not too technical or whatever? There's been more than one study on this topic, but I'll give you...
Please.
So in my study, it was people, we asked them to give a speech, impromptu, and it was going to be videotaped and somebody was going to evaluate it. So it's like most people, if you ask them like their top fears, that's number one, and death is number two. Okay, most people are really afraid of like public speaking, and Zoom public speaking is worse, by the way. But anyway, but most people are afraid of it, and so we did this thing because we knew from previous research that this would activate their stress response, that we would see a peak in their cortisol, and we measured their empathy before this, and what we found is that the people who had higher empathy, especially cognitive empathy, perspective taking, those people showed a little tiny peak. And guess what? You should, because if you're not at all feeling if there's no variation at all in your hormones, there's something wrong. It actually helps us to prepare for events and to handle them. It gives us the energy to handle them. But they didn't have the extreme peak. They didn't have that very toxic, overwhelming stress hormone response. But that's correlational, obviously, right? So we're just finding empathic people have this different response. But there's better evidence out there than my own study. And in this study that I really love by Abelson and colleagues, they actually asked people also to give a speech. It was like a fake job interview. And they randomly assigned half of the people were going to give a speech on why they should get this job and because it would help others. So how if they got the job, they could help others. So that's a kind of empathy focus, a compassion focus. And then the other people were just asked, how would you benefit if you got this job? And what they found is the people who were asked to focus on how they could help others actually had a significant lower stress response in this stressful job interview situation. So it just shows you it's a causal link that when we shift our mind, which we get to control at any time, but when we shift our mind into focusing on others' needs and how we can benefit others, it actually has an immediate effect on reducing our own stress.
Interesting. There's an interesting question here. Is empathy, after all, deeply selfish because it's practiced for the sake of conscience?
Oh, that's interesting. That's like hard for me to answer because I'm not a philosopher. It's a very deep philosophical question about sort of, a lot of people wonder, is altruism truly altruistic if you're doing it because it makes you feel good or because you get this benefit from it? But I think it's very hard for us. I do want to say about motivations is that it's very hard for any person to just have purely empathic or purely compassionate focus. We're complicated. We often can have more than one reason to do something. And I don't think that makes it less valid. It's just that when we do make other people's needs part of our decision-making and part of our motivation, that benefits others and it can also benefit ourselves. So I think that the conscience part, satisfying our own conscience, I guess I just accept that we ourselves are included in the equation of compassion. And so I don't really see that as selfish. I just think we're human too. And a healthy person will take care of themselves as well as taking care of others.
I think this might also touch upon this whole idea of being in individualistic societies versus a collective, where people feel like the collective is above the personal. But maybe I'm reading too much in the question. But let's move to another one here about burnout. Empathy leading to academic outcomes in this context. Does burnout occur? How and why? And actually, there was another one here about that burnout. Is there research stipulating the effects of empathy or compassion fatigue over differing time frames and settings? Yeah. So burnout, fatigue, do you get tired of being empathetic? I think that's the bottom line for this question.
I'm not sure if that's, I don't know if the definition of compassion fatigue is that we're tired of being empathetic. I think it's oftentimes related to we're exposed to these situations that are traumatizing and a bit overwhelming, and we're activated in our own sense. We're actually experiencing secondary trauma or getting overwhelmed ourselves, and we have less to give because of it. So I think that's a very similar feeling to the feeling of burnout, because one of the symptoms of burnout is what's called depersonalization, and it's when you just stop seeing people as people. They're kind of it's just a negative state where you're just seeing them as things getting in the way of what you're trying to do, or just kind of dehumanizing. And this compassion fatigue, where you just feel like you just can't do this anymore, is really overlapped. Here, this is a cat. I knew she'd come here. It's just predictable every single time she comes. Anyway, this is Willow, everybody, and I hope it helps you feel more empathetic. She's a very sweet 14-year-old kitty who likes to hug. Sorry.
No, that's okay. You were able to control the kids and tell them to stay away, but not the cat, huh?
Well, as you know, that the one thing I have in common with people who own cats is you just can't control cats. I love that. I love that campaign. If you haven't checked it out yet, it's really, really great. So I don't think I answered that very well, but just to say that when I think about compassion fatigue and burnout and empathy, I put compassion fatigue in the same box as burnout. Yeah. So it's not really about compassion. It's about sort of exhaustion and being very depleted. And oftentimes it's because you've been exposed to very difficult things that are challenging. So for example, with compassion fatigue, it's often going to happen in caregiving professions, like whether you're healthcare or some extreme situation where you're seeing a lot of people in distress. But burnout can happen in like any profession. And it just has to do with you're in a workplace setting where you have too many demands on your time and not enough support and resources, which is like a lot of us in a pandemic.
Right. And someone just wrote, is it something we create for ourselves? And I think that's exactly what you're trying to say, that you perceive it as if you're burned out. And yeah, I'm going to be empathetic today. That's it.
Yeah. And actually, that's why I started with that number one, like take care of yourself, right? And I know that some people might see that as like the opposite of empathy or selfish or something, but I mean, no, I mean, there's research on sort of the more aware we are of ourselves, when we can actually do mindfulness training, like learning how to just like be in the moment, being kind to ourselves. And that increases that, like taking care of ourselves as, again, being included in that circle of compassion in a compassionate, kind way, the way you would want to treat other people. That's a very healthy attitude to have. Even though some people might label it selfish, I don't think it is. I think it can be selfish to try to be that martyr who has to be like the kindest person in the room, who's like always helping others and whatever, but isn't really helping because they're so depleted. I'm sorry if you can hear my kitty purr. Is she purring? Can you hear that?
No.
Okay, well, very loud here.
So we have people on the call who are teacher trainers, and
cool.
My friend from Lebanon has a question. Should empathy be integrated in the curriculum, or should it be taught by itself? You reviewed some of the resources available for teachers, but what do you think about that? Should empathy be its own topic?
I think that's a very great question. Should we just include it in sort of all the different subjects, or should we have a separate empathy class? I think it should be integrated, actually, because the study I told you about, the suspension study, those teachers were actually math teachers. They weren't like, social studies or something or whatever. They were math teachers. They were teaching math, and they got 45 minutes online training of how to be more understanding of their students, and then suspension rates went down. So in other words, something worked. So I think that it's one of those things that it's not about making it overt always, right? It's not always about like, okay, now we're going to have our empathy lesson. But it's about, well, one, being a role model and modeling it. I mean, taking care of yourself and making sure you're able to and in a good space where you can. And then just realizing that whatever subject you're teaching, could be science, it could be engineering, there is an empathy piece to it. For example, when you're teaching students to build bridges, there's going to be people driving across those bridges. So like all of the topics that we study and teach in educational context have something to do with others. And learning that, like having that other-oriented lens, both in sort of how we teach and then the expectations we have in our classroom for how peers treat each other and how they work out conflict in the classroom. And then, also how what we're talking about might apply to others in some way. So I think that you can do that integrated, but it's kind of a mindset. And a lot of what you're going to see in the programs I've given you are actual like programs, like they're actually training programs that would be more like an empathy class.
I have to agree on the integration, because I think there is like a group of ProSocial behaviors that could be modeled and could be taught interrelated, and that I think I'm assuming, I haven't done the research on seeing whether it's more impactful or not in changing people and increasing empathy versus hostility, enmity, and others.
And actually that, just to acknowledge, like there hasn't been research done that's compared like the research that's been done has just looked at an empathy program itself and how that might affect the classroom, the individuals in the classroom, and then the school system.
Right.
But I haven't seen them compare that to not just an empathy discrete program, but like, you know, say maybe training the teachers, all the teachers in the
Right.
school, and
Right.
how they might integrate that into their lesson plans.
Mhm.
And let's be honest, from the teacher perspective, that could feel like a lot of extra work and stressful, right? So trying to keep it to big picture principles,
Right.
how to treat other people. It's okay. You don't have to remember the top 10 list or whatever that I came up with today. I think we all kind of know how to treat each other, and like, at least we know when somebody does something to us that doesn't feel good. We can learn from that at least. So it's not about adding more pressure to teachers who are already under-resourced and underpaid and have a lot of expectations in terms of the standards. That's not what this is about. It's about encouraging them that their caring really matters and is making a difference to children's lives. And like, I personally, my own personal story, I had very good teachers in my life. I couldn't be who I am today without them.
Yeah. There's a question about teachers, but I'll ask it. I had another question in mind, but sorry, I wanted to say something about, as a teacher educator myself, I always use the example of teachable moments, where they're not in the curriculum, it's not role modeling, but you have a chance. And the more you know how to identify those pro-social behaviors, the more you could use teachable moments to convey a message of some sort. But that's my point. The question,
I think that's a good, I mean, I think that one of the best things we could do as teachers is actually just talk to each other about what's happening in the classroom.
Right.
And kind of like how to handle situations that come up, because it's American classrooms, at least that's where I'm teaching, the K or the higher ed, it's pretty complex right now in university systems.
Oh, yeah.
And just making sure we are, you know, listening to other people and handling the complex conversations that come up so that people feel heard, but they can also have, you know, have healthy conflict resolution in the classroom it's a big challenge.
Yeah. So question on strategies that could be used by educators to transition to empathy, like someone teaching a history curriculum that's inclusive, intellectually honest, and not biased towards one culture.
Wonderful.
And we'll take two more on social media once we hear your opinions on this one.
I mean,
strategies.
My answer to that is yes. Yes, thinking about who you're representing, whose history you're actually representing, and the voices that are often minimized or aren't heard if you're teaching history, for example. And this is, I think this is true of many disciplines. It's just like, you know, to be thoughtful and reflective of stepping outside of your own perspective. So whatever group identity you might have, we all have many cultural identities, obviously, and being aware of how your cultural identity is influencing like what you're choosing to show to your students, being aware of that, and then trying to like expand outside of that. So just being open to listening to other perspectives and being able to have richer conversations in the classroom.
Yep. Our last speaker, the previous webinar was on open-mindedness and how that, you know, and it doesn't mean that you're just accepting everything or you're being very, you know, but I think there is probably also some kind of an interrelation, correlation of some sort between being open-mindedness, flexible, and empathy. And that takes us, our time is running out, and I wanted to talk a little bit. There is a question about empathy and digital learning. When you came online, I mentioned to you this whole question about does social media erode our empathy, and you touched upon it, but I would like to hear some more about that and how does the media and social media, not necessarily just the online learning and Zoom, but also social media mobilizing people, you know, after to be empathetic for one cause. I mean, I don't want to go too far, but look at the Ukraine right now versus Russia. There's a lot of push and, you know, and discourse to be empathetic to that cause versus others.
Right.
How do you think that social media piece plays a role in that?
I think to answer your bigger question, not just sort of is social media eroding our empathy, but the bigger question of sort of how social media might work to influence our empathy. What we have access to now with the new technologies is more stories, more empathy stories from all over the world, from that we were never exposed to this historically. So I just think we have an expanded sense of the variety of perspectives out there. That being said, we still often want to stick to whatever it is we feel comfortable with and we know. Very few of us are naturally picking, going on Twitter or going to news sources that are the opposite of our own political beliefs, for example. And nobody wants to do that. It doesn't feel good. But there's research showing we're just in this filter bubble, right? Like the algorithms are giving us what we like. And it means we can expand in some ways, but not as much as we could. And it's not to say that every single thing is acceptable, because I also believe open-mindedness is a strong value for me, but I still stand against oppression at the same time. But it's good to understand other people, even if you disagree with them. And that's perspective taking itself is a very helpful skill for that. And I mean, I remember in my What's the Matter with Empathy article, I think it was Hillary Clinton, I think I mentioned this quote from her, but she was trying to, at one point she asked to take the perspective of somebody who had attacked the United States. And she got in huge trouble for saying that she said she thought it was a very smart skill to try to understand where they're coming from. Not that she was endorsing them, but people were very angry with her for even, imagining from their perspective. And I think that by itself, you can imagine someone's perspective and you can disagree with them. It doesn't mean you actually believe what they believe or endorse it, but it could help you to try to understand solutions in a very difficult problem.
Yeah, and that requires its own webinar, right? on the bigger picture.
Right.
I don't want to finish without answering this really good question about if you're designing an undergraduate course. Sorry, I'm gonna see it. What major topics would you include in an undergraduate course on empathy or incorporate in an allied course?
Like you get to teach a class just on empathy? That's like lucky you.
I know.
Even I don't get to do that, but if you do get to, then yay. And I would just start with the research on it, like the definitions is a really good place to include it. I think that understanding the controversies in empathy as well, right? Like I think you referred to this a little bit, Dr. Nasser, of like side taking, right? You kind of like, sometimes empathy makes you want to pick a side. It depends on the type of empathy, but you still kind of like need to have that flexibility and be careful how you use it. And so the controversies really matter. And also I think if I was going to design a course like that, which I would love to, then I would want to also include action, because I think my personal view is the purpose of empathy isn't just to sit there and feel compassion, it's to think about what you can do to alleviate other people's suffering. And again, from their perspective, not to come in and like swoop in and make decisions for other people, but by listening, by observing, as a donor, for example, by giving unrestricted funds, what can you do to alleviate suffering? To me, that's the purpose of empathy.
Absolutely, totally agree. And I think that one of the lessons we learned from our research is that it's not enough to touch the cognitive, the head, the heart, but really the hands. What do you do with that? What do you do to change your life, others' life, to better human lives and so forth? So with this note, I want to thank you again so much for your insightful work on empathy, for your wisdom, for your stories about your research and about your experiences, and for giving us your time. I know you're very, very busy, and we thank you for that. And I hope people with me here feel the same way. I want to thank you again, and just watch our announcements, our newsletter regarding the next webinar. I want to thank everyone for being with us, and have a wonderful day, and we'll meet again. Thank you, Sarah.